Hello and welcome to BNAP Today, August 5, 2020. I'm Mike Ryan. Coming up on the show today, China to retaliate if the US acts against its journalist. A Japanese company goes to war with South Korea. Investors are most bullish on Microsoft and Amazon, according to Nick Collis from DataTrek Research. We talk COVID-19 with one of Australia's leading economics communicators, Professor Gigi Foster. Plus, we're joined by Senator Malcolm Roberts from Pauline Hanson's One Nation, and he believes the lockdown in Victoria will succeed. But first, the headlines. China has vowed to retaliate if the United States persisted with hostile action against Chinese journalists who may be forced to leave in the coming days if their US visas are not extended. Ed Barron has more.
China is vowing to retaliate against the United States if Washington continues, quote, hostile action against Chinese journalists. Journalists who may be forced to leave in coming days if their US visas aren't extended. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin said no Chinese journalist in the United States have been granted a visa extension since the US, in mid-May, limited their stay to 90 days, with an option to extend. Wang didn't say how many Chinese journalists were affected or what retaliation China might consider. But the editor of China's Global Times newspaper, which is published by the Communist Party, said earlier that US journalists based in Hong Kong would be among those targeted should Chinese journalists be forced to leave the United States. The two countries, whose relations have deteriorated sharply recently over various issues, including trade and the novel coronavirus, have exchanged several tit-for-tat actions involving journalists in recent months. Such a move would also follow the recent closures of diplomatic consulates in both countries.
A major Japanese company is fighting the South Korean government over a decision to seize its assets over a practice of forced labour during World War II. Gloria So reports.
A major Japanese company is fighting the South Korean government over a decision to seize its assets because of its behavior during World War II. Japan's Nippon Steel was given a court order back in 2018 to pay reparations to the tune of $80,000 to 4 South Koreans who were subject to forced labor by the company during the war. But a later court decision also allowed for the seizure of some of its assets. Nippon Steel is now appealing that ruling. The Japanese government says the issue of compensation was settled under a 1965 treaty and that South Korea's ruling violated international law. Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga said Tuesday,
Japan has been repeatedly pointing out that we must avoid monetizing Nippon Steel's assets, which would cause a serious situation. We would like to continue to strongly urge the South Korean side to swiftly solve the issue.
After the ruling, Japan said last year it would stop preferential treatment for shipments of 3 materials to South Korea. Japan dominates production of those materials, and they are used by prominent South Korean firms like tech giant Samsung. Seoul has filed a complaint to the World Trade Organization over the export curbs, which remain in place for 2 of the 3 materials. The World Trade Organization set up a panel last month to rule on the complaint.
DataTrek researchers Nick Collis says his survey of investors showed they're most optimistic about the long-term prospects for shares of Amazon and Microsoft.
Stocks edging higher Tuesday, with the S&P 500 getting closer to its all-time high thanks to a rally in tech stocks. Are tech stocks in a bubble? Let's ask that question to Nick Collis of DataTrek Research. He's done a study on this recently. Welcome back, Nick.
Thank you.
Well, Nick, according to your survey, do investors believe that tech stocks are in a bubble?
Well, we surveyed our customers, who are everybody from hedge fund managers here in New York to family offices all around the country, a lot of international investors as well, and they were very evenly split. It was 44% said yes, it was a bubble, 56% said no. And within the margin of error, that's basically 50-50. So there's a fundamental disagreement about this. Some people say it is, some people say it isn't.
Are there any stocks that they particularly favor that they still think they're bullish about?
Yes, the two stocks that came out most in our survey are Amazon and Microsoft for long-term potential. I think because Microsoft is seen as the safe set of hands in this space, and Amazon still has a lot of growth to come. On the other side, they did not like Facebook at all and said Facebook was the most overvalued of the big tech names.
Now, given the results of your survey, what are the implications for investors or takeaways? I mean, you could possibly go with that contrarian argument that if you got that many, what that percentage saying they believe tech stocks are in a bubble, do you do the contrarian play?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I think our takeaway from this survey was that the market is really struggling with an existential question, namely, is technology in some kind of new order where basically everything that grows is technology and things that don't are not technology? Because we're looking at now 35% of the S&P directly or directly technology-based, all-time record highs. And in order to buy them here, you have to believe it's going to go to 40 or 45%. We personally do think it will go that way because, as Mark Andreessen said, software is eating everything, including market cap. But we totally understand the discomfort that investors have in thinking through that process and agreeing that they can still work from here.
So is it a new normal, the stay-at-home boom, that you think that it's here to stay and therefore you should continue to hold on to those tech stocks as opposed to selling it off?
Yeah, that's a piece of it. The other piece of it is that the last 6 months have accelerated technological change that would have taken 5 to 7 years to do otherwise. And so we're seeing the benefit of that for tech stocks. Unfortunately, a lot of other industries really hurting, but it is really helping technology. And we haven't seen so much work from home stick around, but just everything else is going to stick around for a lot longer.
And lastly, Nick, the dollar had its worst month in a decade in July. What does this mean for equity investors, especially equity index fund investors, with so much of the S&P 500 earnings coming from abroad?
That's absolutely right. 40% of the S&P 500 revenues come from non-U.S. sources, and so a weaker dollar definitely helps profits. We're telling clients, we get this question a lot, we're telling clients a weaker dollar does not matter. It's really a sign that the global economy is recalibrating and beginning to readjust, and that's healthy. That's actually a positive for risk assets. So we're bullish despite the fact that the dollar is getting weaker. We see it as a positive.
And what does it mean for emerging market stocks, for example? Often they say they benefit from a weaker dollar. Then again, you got the pandemic that's hammering their economies.
Yep, no, you got it exactly right. That's the push-pull of the EM trade. Look, EM has been working pretty well. A weaker dollar definitely helps. We wouldn't overthink it. As risky as EM is definitely a place to look right now for value because it is so much cheaper than the U.S. market.
Okay, thanks, Nick. That's all the time we got.
Thank you.
Take care. Our thanks to Nick Colas of DataTrek Research. I'm Fred Katayama in New York. This is Reuters.
Coming up next, Professor Gigi Foster.
We are lions. We bring hope where it's needed. We are a global force for good. Join the movement. Support causes that matter. Change lives. Change communities. Change the world. We can do more together than we can alone. Join in. Experience the joy of serving. Be part of the movement. Give back. Let's unite the world for good. We are lions. You can be too. Visit weserve.org.
Gigi Foster is one of Australia's leading economics communicators and a professor at the University of New South Wales School of Economics. Professor Gigi Foster has come under fire for her views on living with coronavirus and how Australia will survive. Professor Gigi Foster, great to see you again. Do I call you Professor or just Gigi?
Either one is fine.
But never call you late, isn't that right? And look, just before we get into this, I'm amazed that you're still alive after watching you on the Australian ABC Q&A. You got out alive. Thank goodness they didn't have a big audience. That's all I can say.
I don't mind being the only Christian in a bunch of lions. It's important to have both sides of the debate represented. So I feel it's a public service to do that sort of thing, and I can take the heat. So it should, I'm happy to do it.
Do you think there's a serious restriction of debate in this country over government management of COVID-19, or both together? It just seems to shut you down. If you mention anything to do with the economy, then you're an evil person. And then if you mention all things about how we're going to keep everybody alive, then you're Joan of Arc. And from the Q&A, you weren't that one, at least.
Very much so. I've gotten a lot of emails and messages since my recent appearances on national TV from people who basically say, we agree with you, but we don't feel comfortable agreeing with those kinds of views or putting those kinds of views out in public. All that happens is around our dinner table, we exchange these opinions sort of secretively, furtively. It gives me sort of an impression that people are operating as they may have done in occupied France. It's sort of, we can't be seen to be not towing this line, and so we have to keep it to ourselves. And I think that's very damaging for the quality of public debate and the ability of our institutions to deliver actually the best policy for Australia, because everything has become about towing the right line, going along with the crowd, and that's not the way to make policy for people. And so it's been very troubling. I've not seen really any other public figures who will be willing to go on public television and national television and say the kinds of things I've been saying, but I think many people are thinking them. I don't know whether it's a silent majority, but it's an increasingly large fraction of Australians who are thinking these thoughts and just don't feel comfortable saying them.
Except for the medical, have any aspects of the management of COVID-19 been data-driven?
Well, the first time I was on ABC Q&A in April, I actually asked that question of Joni McVernon, saying, is it true that the only thing driving policy at the start of this was the epidemiological modeling and that economic costs were not considered? And she essentially admitted that they hadn't considered the economic costs. So I think that, yes, there's a whole swath of data and evidence about what shutting down the economy does to people, and specifically what the measures we've taken have done to people. So social distancing and the blocking of borders and all the various different measures we've taken. And not just in Australia are these data now available. I mean, many countries have had similar kinds of restrictions, and they've lived in this sort of hysteria, this fear-based kind of environment for a while. And so we can use their data on what's happened to their populations to infer what might have been happening here, even if we've not been collecting the data properly. So, inevitably at the start of a very uncertain environment, which is what we were facing in March, you do have to rely on models more than data. We have some data, but you also have to project forward using assumptions. And ideally, the scientific method dictates that you confront those models that you initially use with data as that data arises, as it becomes available, as you live through the crisis. And that's what we've not done here. And that's been very troubling to me, because again, it shows a lack of adaptability of our policy to the actual needs of the circumstance.
So why do we have so few options? Shut down or not shutting it down? What do you suggest? What should we do to get through this, say, for the betterment of the economy?
Well, I think in this, as in many other policy settings, what we should do is look at the data on where the threat really is, and then tailor our response to the parts of the population, the sectors, the areas, the times when there is highest vulnerability. And we know in the case of this virus that it is particularly virulent in regard to older people, right? Even in some place like Sweden, fewer than 300 people under the age of 50 have died of this thing. Right? So it is really mainly claiming elderly, older people. And I know that it can infect younger people, but the statistics don't lie. And this is one of the things I've noticed in the debate. If you can cite a statistic, frequently people will come back with an anecdote, right? Oh, but I know a 25-year-old. Yeah, okay, sure. So, occasionally there's a woman who's 6'5". That doesn't negate the fact that most women are shorter than men, right? Than most men, right? It's sort of an averages versus an anecdote kind of thing. So if we think about those data on death rates by age and death rates by morbidity status, by immunocompromised status, then it tells us that where we should be focusing our efforts is on protecting our vulnerable, protecting the elderly, protecting the people who have immune problems. And that means looking overseas to see what has been done in places like Florida, in places like Sweden, which did make mistakes early on in terms of not protecting the elderly as well as they could. And they suffered a lot of deaths in old age homes, unfortunately, because of those mistakes. But they've now learned. We should be on the phone to people in Sweden, on the phone to people in Florida, saying what works, what tactics, what methods, what can we do to creatively protect those portions of the population that really are at serious risk of this thing, for whom COVID-19 is a far greater risk than an average flu or an average disease of any sort that causes pneumonia and lung infection, and then allow everybody else to get back to work, get back to their activities in the way that they feel safe doing that. And of course, because of the fear, we're going to have lesser participation in various areas of the economy by some people. But by and large, if we at least allow people to start making their own decisions at the coalface about what's best for them, and then have strong recommendations in regard to the vulnerable, that is a more proportionate response than this blanket lockdown.
You mentioned Florida, for example. Florida is now the epicenter for coronavirus or COVID-19 throughout the US. In the East, in Asia, for example, South Korea as an example, they couldn't do enough to make sure that all the data was there and that the facts were on hand for all the experts. Whereas in the West, we have this sort of a blasé sort of thing, don't we, where parties were happening and the virus spread. Do you think maybe our cultural difference is part of the problem also in not eradicating, but just living and controlling to our best extent COVID-19?
Well, I think there are a couple things to say about that. The first is that when somebody gets a message from the government that they don't believe, because it's not actually data-based, it's not actually evidence-driven, they're not actually told why the policy setting is what it is, over time, those kinds of messages, they erode people's confidence in what the government is saying. And it's going to make them angrier and more frustrated, and they are going to lash out. Which is kind of understandable. If somebody keeps telling you to do something that is not the best way to deal with a threat or deal with a situation that you're facing, then you kind of lose respect for the source of the message, right? And that makes you more likely to be hostile against any request that source of the message makes of you later on. And so that really doesn't help when the Australian government, essentially treats people like babies, like they don't have brains and they have to be, scared into taking extreme actions, which actually haven't been proven to, in fact, be the right way to handle this crisis. And people's confidence in the government then will erode. And so it may erupt in those kinds of violation behaviors. The second thing to say is that I'm much more worried about deaths and extreme symptomology, which is correlated with deaths, than I am about infection counts, for a number of reasons. First of all, infection counts, of course, we know are a function of the testing regime, and testing regimes differ depending on the locale. So how many people you end up thinking are infected will differ greatly across regions just because of the testing regime being different. And secondly, we know that in many other infectious diseases, infection, if it doesn't lead to serious symptoms or death, can develop some level of immunoresponse in the infected individual. Now, we don't know how long that lasts, and we have all sorts of uncertainty about that. But it may be that infecting younger people and then, releasing them back to the wild is actually a viable strategy as a defense for the more vulnerable population in the long run. And we do see in Sweden right now, for example, with those death counts coming down to 1 or 2 per day, they seem to have developed some sort of an equilibrium where they're not seeing, that nasty rise in deaths that they were seeing before. So it may not be herd immunity, but it's some combination of the settings they've got in terms of their responses, hand washing, distancing, whatever, and what's happened immunologically in their population that have delivered for them an effective scenario where the virus isn't as dangerous. And that's what we'd like to have here in Australia.
So where do you see Victoria being once the 6 weeks or 8 weeks have gone on this COVID-19 shutdown? How will the economy be?
I don't have a crystal ball there, but we've certainly seen projections of GDP declines for Australia that are 5-6%, something like that. And I would definitely expect that, obviously, Victoria is a very important contributor, particularly in the area of higher education. You've got a lot of universities over there. And as I mentioned on Q&A recently, we don't have an end game here that the universities can look at or the international tourism industry can look at and say, oh, okay, by that point, at least we'll be able to let some people in and continue to do our business. And so we are really, if we don't open those borders, at some point in the next 6 to 12 months anyway, we are going to have a completely restructured higher education sector, a totally restructured tourism sector. These sectors, which are, Victoria contributes to a lot, are going to be massively hit. And again, I don't think people are really thinking about those effects, which are just logical. They're just logical effects. And instead, what we get is this notion of, oh, well, this is our chance to reform Australia and pursue a different industrial structure and whatnot. Well, some of that might be a good idea, and I think there are some opportunities to do some positive things for the country. But the idea that we should stab our international education and international tourism industries in the stomach on the altar of protection from COVID-19, I think is extremely short-sighted, very blinkered. We have comparative advantages in those areas. And if we give those advantages up and we just say, well, forget it, we're not going to invest so much in that, it puts us on a different position in relation to all the other countries. And Asia as a whole will look at us very differently. If we're not able to provide education in English language, Western environments, which is one of the big comparative advantages that we have here in Asia, I don't like to think about what it's going to look like. I mean, I'm not sure that we'll have the pulling power to actually get really highly educated international scholars to come here because, we're not going to have the money and the interest in the international links.
Since we've seen you.
You've been stuck at home all this time.
So we reckon you deserve a holiday.
You deserve to stretch your legs.
You deserve a little sun and fun.
You deserve some chill time.
A bit of thrill time.
A bit of you time.
Australia, you deserve to play through.
You deserve a long lunch.
You deserve a sleep in.
You deserve to hang out. Woo!
You deserve a drink.
Or two.
Australia, you deserve some playtime.
Senator Malcolm Roberts from Pauline Hanson's One Nation believes the lockdown in Victoria will succeed. However, testing needs to be quicker. He also believes that government needs to be more truthful. Now, Victoria has serious problems with infection control. Will a harder breakdown be effective if they don't know the source of so many infections?
Well, I think there are two things I need to say in response to that, Mike. And that is that, first of all, this is a very difficult issue. We said that right from the start on the single day sittings on 23rd of March and 8th of April. when we said there's no manual for this, it's entirely new, we've got to give the government lots of room. We voted in favour of we supported them on their packages, and away we went. But we said, you've got to get the data, and you've got to look elsewhere and start to manage this in accordance with the best practice around the world. So we might come back to that more later, but what we've learned is that quite often the places where people have prolonged contact in close quarters is where the virus transmission is highest, and that's the family unit and workplaces. So the family unit in Melbourne is older than in any other city. And that's significant because I also saw these figures on one of the radio stations, heard the figures rather, on one of the radio stations. The other thing about Melbourne is that it's flat and people travel very easily, and they travel to watch football matches, sporting events, games, social venues, etc. So I think that it is difficult, and number one priority is life, securing life, making sure people are healthy and secure and safe. And so a lockdown is essential because they've lost control of their borders. They've let it go, and lost control of the virus within, I think, where people are speaking foreign languages. So they've lost control of that because people have not been able to understand the messages about the virus. So that's where the outbreaks have been. And so I think the lockdown will be effective because it'll stop families, the extended families visits, and it'll stop work, obviously. And so I think the lockdowns will be successful in Melbourne. The other thing is that they need to get testing done more quickly because some people are basically having a test and not getting the result back for about 10 days. Now, they're not going to stay cooped up for 10 days if they don't believe they're sick. And many of these cases, they're asymptomatic. So I think that while it will work, the government has got to do its bit in getting testing to be more responsive and get results back in 2 or 3 days rather than 10. So there's potential. It's interesting. In South Korea, the testing, from the testing to getting the results back, 12 hours. And that's what it should be. And when I was talking to Professor Justin Fendos in South Korea last week, and he was saying that 12 hours, and I mentioned that we have at times up to 10 days. And I could hear his jaw hit the table. That's just atrocious. What should the authorities be doing, though? Well, let's come back to Taiwan, if you don't mind, because South Korea has done a marvellous job. Do you mind if we talk about that? Yeah, for sure. Okay, South Korea has done a marvellous job. They actually let it go, and they had to recover. So given that, and by the way, I watched your interview with Professor Bendos, a fabulous interview, very well-spoken man, knows his facts, and he has been on the same track we've been from the start on Monday, March 23rd and April the 8th in the Senate single-day hearings. We also said, make sure that you get the data to the federal government when we gave them our support. And we said, make sure you look to Taiwan and Southeast Asia. The Southeast Asian nations, Taiwan especially, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, have done a marvellous job. Singapore, with the exception of Singapore, all the other three, and Israel, which had also done a good job, Mike, they have eternal vigilance, and they're ready to respond quickly to threats because they're constantly under threat. So that is something we don't have. But in Taiwan, their population is about the same as Australia. They have 24 million, we have 25. The population density in Taiwan is far, far higher than us because their 24 are crammed into a small island. And they also had earlier and stronger exchange with China because, well, they're Chinese themselves. And so they had a lot more traveling between Taiwan and mainland China. And so they had a much greater problem. Now, what the Taiwanese did, and we need to recognize that Australia has had, 130 deaths, and that's good. But the Taiwanese have had 7, even despite they had an earlier contact with the virus, 7. And the other significant point with the Taiwanese is that they didn't lock down their economy. They actually kept their economy going, and they gave responsibility to the people. Now, there are 3 things that they have done really well. First of all, their basic strategy was to isolate the sick and isolate the vulnerable. That's what real quarantine is. Quarantine is not isolating everyone into lockdown. Quarantine is isolating the sick and the vulnerable and separating them out. The second thing they did was that they implemented massive testing. and they have a screening process for their testing, and I think South Korea is the same. They test for high temperature, knowing that that's not always reliable, but they test for high temperature. If someone has a high temperature, then they go and get tested for COVID. And if they test negative, but they still have for COVID, but still have a high temperature, then they're allowed to go to work. So they put responsibility on the workplaces. And what we've got in those countries is responsibility on the individual citizens. And when you have that responsibility, there's a far greater sense of accountability rather than when it's imposed. And the other thing that they've done, and I've only learned about this recently, is they've got a much stricter tracing regime. But the tracing apparently doesn't go right into people's whereabouts. It goes into their localities, and that helps the authorities then get one step in front. So what I think now, with those lessons from Taiwan, and we encourage the government to look at Taiwan and South Korea, what I think that we should be doing now is we should be in Australia revising and reviewing our current work. How effective have we been? Where have we not been effective? We need to recover and plan for recovery in two areas. First of all, to get our economy back to pre-COVID, which is February. But then we need to aim far, far higher, Mike. We need to get our economy back to the point where we have our sovereignty restored, our economic sovereignty, and our economic security and our independence. We've been following this nonsense from the United Nations now for almost 70 years, and it's destroying our sovereignty and our economic independence. And so what the UN has been preaching and our governments have been preaching is interdependence, which means that we are dependent on other countries. And so what we need to do is to get back our productive capacity, especially for manufacturing and agriculture. And then the third thing we need to do is to plan for future viruses, because this won't be the last one. And so the biggest thing of all, Mike, that we've learned is that the Taiwanese, the South Koreans, the Israelis, the Singaporeans, they trust their government. They don't give them carte blanche, but they do trust their government. And the governments lead. In this country, governments are too busy fabricating policies and misrepresenting the circumstances. We haven't seen the truth on this from the Prime Minister. We haven't seen the truth on this from Daniel Andrews, nor Anastasia Palaszczuk. We wrote to Anastasia Palaszczuk and said, "Where's your data? We want to have a look at it." She said it's in 2 locations. We went to both locations. There is no data. So Scott Morrison, right up front, he was saying 6 months hibernation, 6 months hibernation, 6 months hibernation. We knew there was no plan, and now we know there's no data driving that plan. These governments are not trusted in this country on a range of issues: electricity, agriculture, stealing farmers' property rights. I mean, you could go on forever, selling ourselves out to international agreements, selling ourselves out to free trade agreements that are giving the other parties the power. We have got to establish trust in our government, and that can only come with reliance on data and reliance on telling the truth. The time Australia got back to that.
Just wondering about the data. To have the data, we need all the input. We actually have that at our fingertips with credit cards and with Apple, for example, and the other Android devices, and we can actually find out where people have been. The problem we have at the moment, according to Professor Fendos, was that it's reliant on us being honourable or telling the truth. So by having all that data available, it's going to impact on, inverted commas, civil liberties.
Well, I go back to my experience. When I graduated from university with a mining engineering degree, I thought I'd better go out and start learning something that really mattered. So I worked as a miner for about 3 years, various mines around the country, and then I went overseas and worked in mines overseas. So I worked at the coalface, and I developed a very healthy respect for miners, for all people. And then when I became a mine manager, I would go underground a lot, not to do people's work, but just to listen and to look so that I could understand what they were going through and what their needs were. And I can remember turning up at one mine brand new, and the workforce detested the mine management because the mine management told lies. And it took me a few months, but people started to trust me. And that's extremely important. And then what I was able to do was also to hand over responsibility and authority to the people doing the job. I mean, not everything. We can't expect a miner to make every decision for the business, but their own jobs. And when people are given that responsibility and that authority, they usually come good. And so what's happening here is government tries to impose things in a crisis, and where a lot of Australians then distrust that. But in Southeast Asia, they're already practicing those things, and we've got to give got to give those governments credit because they've had SARS before, so we understand that that's made it easier. But they've learned from that, and they've put it into practice, and people are now trusting the government. So if the government tells the truth, if the government hands over responsibility to business owners, venue managers, then they'll see the people respond, because then people take accountability. When it's shoved on them under threat and under control, it's not taken, but accountability is taken when there's freedom for people to make decisions. That autonomy is really important, and we've got to keep giving trust back to people in this country and get the government the hell out of people's lives.
What about state governments? So when we have this, we're all Australians, but we have the new country of Queensland, the new country of Victoria, the new country of New South Wales, South Australia, blah, 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 blah. And each state has its own, not agenda, but its own approach. And maybe an agenda also. It becomes a little bit political, because we're the Joan of Arc of WA, we're the Joan of Arc of Victoria, Tasmania. So how do we get all the states working as one country instead of being a number of different countries within this terrible state of Australia?
Well, first of all, the thing that unites strategies is data. When everyone's got the correct data, you'll end up seeing strategies similar, but across every state, but they'll be fine-tuned for each state, because Queensland is the only state in the country, yes, that's correct, it's the only state in the country where there are more people outside the capital city than inside the capital city. We're more decentralised, we're more spread up the coast with a sparse population inland. And so that's different from Victoria, that's different from Tassie, that's different from New South Wales, and then Western Australia is different again. So I'm very much a believer in our constitution, our federal constitution, which is based on competitive federalism, giving huge amounts of sovereignty to the independent states. Only on national issues should we come together. That's defence, border security, foreign affairs, those kinds of things. And so I'm in favour of letting the states run, but the states themselves also need to get the data so that they can manage effectively, and they need to manage in a trustworthy way. The fundamental thing that we did wrong in this country, I believe, with COVID, was that we looked automatically to Britain and to a man called Neil Ferguson. And that was a mistake. This Neil Ferguson has done, I've forgotten the name of the school in medical college in Britain, but he's in there, and they've done a lot of modelling. And his models have been proven to be completely wacky. They have exaggerated the consequences of just about every virus they've cared to model, every disease they've cared to model. Foot and mouth disease, they cost the British government, way back then when a billion was worth a billion, $10 billion they cost the British farm economy. They have completely exaggerated. They've forecast millions of deaths went out of a virus, or out of a disease in Britain, when there were only 120 deaths. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. We looked to them, went straight to lockdown. We didn't look to Asia. We should have looked at Taiwan as well as Britain and worked out where the reality is. Donald Trump himself started calling out the British, and I don't think he named Ferguson, but that's what he was implying. And we should be coming up with our own strategy, but looking at Taiwan, looking at everywhere in the world, and then developing our own. So it's up to the state governments. I believe they should be independent. They should be working independently. That's what gives us greater accountability. It worked up until about 1923, and then that's been smashed, and we've centralized more and more. So we need to get back to that competitive federalism, independent states working together, and when they've got data, they will have a solid plan. We've got to get back to truthful government that relies upon objective data.
Very interesting times. We must continue more discussions. There's so many questions or conversation pieces, such as border control, the forthcoming Queensland elections in Australia, the economy, and even football. So we can do that next time.
I look forward to it, Mike. We're happy to contact me anytime.
Senator Malcolm Roberts, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. All the best.
And that's it for BNAP Today, August 5, 2020. Be safe, be kind. I'm Mike Ryan.